Hello and welcome to another episode of Blueprint Cymru, where we explore ideas, experiences and look at the ambition for conversations to build a better future for Wales. My name is Simon Hobson, and in today's episode I'm joined by Professor Dylan Jones-Evans OBE. Dylan is one of the UK's leading voices on entrepreneurship and innovation, appointed Wales's first Professor of Entrepreneurship in 1996. He has spent three decades championing startups and scale-ups, and he's also co-founder of Ideas Community, responsible for Startup UK Awards, the UK Fast Growth Index, and the Great British Entrepreneur Awards, and Ideas Fest. He has advised governments, worked with the OECD and the European Union, helped create the Development Bank of Wales, and continues to invest and mentor growing firms. Dylan was awarded his OBE in 2013 for services to business and entrepreneurship. So in today's episode, we will hopefully explore and talk about enterprise, ambition, finance, and what Wales must do if it is going to be serious about building a high growth economy. So welcome to the podcast, Dylan. Thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So I always ask my guests, within reason, whatever they're comfortable about talking about, a bit of their childhood and how they got to where they are in life.
I'm from Pwllheli in North Wales, and both my parents had their own businesses. My mother was, I think she was 18 when she started her own business, and she got a great aunt to basically put a house up as deposit because the bank wouldn't lend any money. And the sad thing is, 60 odd years later, many women, particularly young women, are facing exactly the same issue. So there's a lot still to do in that area. I went to my local comprehensive school, which was about 200 yards away from where I lived. My parents' house was right on the seafront in Pwllheli. So everybody else says beaches and views of the Cymru Mountains are beautiful. I was brought up there all my life. So and the one thing, there is a view of Snowdon from the back window, which is beautiful in the winter, as it recently has been. And I have this terrible admittance at nearly, with being 60 in 3 months' time, that I never climbed Snowdon. So I think it's something that my partner's going to drag me up there. She's actually done the 3 peaks, so she's trying to drag me up there. So yeah, I grew up in a very small town, full of small businesses. Decided to go and study physics, of all things, in Cardiff University, which is where I live in Cardiff now. I think the problem is when you go to Cardiff, it's like one of those, it sort of drags you back. It's like a living embodiment of The Godfather. Every time you try and get away, it drags you back in. So I sort of came back to Cardiff nearly 20 years ago after being at various in universities, and I love it. So I went from doing physics to doing a master's in industrial strategy to doing a PhD on technology entrepreneurship. And then I worked my way at various institutions from Dublin to Durham, coming back to Wales in 96. So it's 30 years since I came back to Wales. And then 3 years ago, I suppose I saw, and we can talk a bit more about this, I saw what was happening with higher education, and it'd been a long time for me in higher education, and my partner and I decided to take what we've done in terms of entrepreneurship and create one organization. And so we've gone from, I think there were 3 of us when we started, to employing 14 people now in the team, and really trying to expand and change and influence and do a whole range of things that probably as an academic I couldn't do, but now I can as, shall we say, I hate to say the word, but yes, I'm an entrepreneur.
Yeah, I was told that once, that Simon, you're an entrepreneur, but you can't call yourself an entrepreneur.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
the interesting thing about entrepreneurship is, it was a term coined by a French-Irish economist called Richard Cantillon, and it means basically the person in between. So when people, take the mick when they look at things like and say, oh, Del Boy wasn't an entrepreneur on Only Fools and Horses, actually he was the perfect entrepreneur. He bought goods and he sold them for a profit. And that is essentially what the original meaning of entrepreneur. But of course, it's become a bit slightly more complicated with the emergence of people like Steve Jobs and Mark Zuckerberg over the last 30 years.
Yeah, actually, as you've opened up that as a topic of conversation, it's quite interesting. It's a bit like rhetoric in politics. It's a skill that one needs to have, but it's also developed a bit of like a dirty word to be, people say, oh, you're just spilling out rhetoric. And I feel like the same with entrepreneurship. Sometimes people can use it in a derogatory way. Like, it's like you're out there to take from the world rather than give. Have you ever found that? I mean, that's my personal view of things.
Yeah, I've heard various critiques of, that entrepreneurs are only there to make money. If you look at most of the studies, for example, I'll give you a perfect example is there's a magazine in the United States called Inc., and they do an annual thing of the Inc. 5,000, the 5,000 fastest growing companies in the USA, which inspired me to do something similar in Wales. We'll come on to that later. But they do an annual survey of these highly successful entrepreneurs who run these companies, who founded them and are still running them. And it's always interesting to find that, 10% of those people who start a business say they're doing it for the money. 90% have different reasons, because they wanted to turn their idea into a product, or they perceived an opportunity, and all these things. So there's always this perception or myth about entrepreneurs. I mean, of course, they've got to make money, because if you don't make money and you don't make a profit, you can't employ people, you can't invest in innovation, you can't support your local communities. So that is the driving force, I suppose, in terms of what the business needs to do. But for many entrepreneurs, it's about realizing their dream, or, turning maybe an idea into a product or a service. But in doing so, obviously, they generate wealth, and that wealth is critical for the prosperity of the country, because not everybody can actually, be an entrepreneur, because you need people to work for entrepreneurs as well. But by having those individuals within society, it actually creates, the jobs, the wealth, the innovation we need for the economy to flourish.
Why is it you think that there can be this negative perception around entrepreneurs, and I think that sometimes in places such as Wales, that can create a mindset of not wanting to try.
Well, it's interesting, because I was involved 25 years ago when we started something called the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor in the United Kingdom. It's part of a global sort of study of entrepreneurship in about 60 countries. And one of the key sort of questions there, in the survey is, would fear of failure stop you from starting a business? And it's always interesting to see it's always about 40 to 50% in the UK will say that. And in Wales, it's quite similar. Actually, it's always slightly higher. And I think I don't know if it's the chapel thing, or the family thing, or, what would your Auntie Gladys say if your business went bust? You bring shame on the family, this sort of thing. And, maybe it's that societal hangover that we have in Wales, in terms of that, if you fail, it's like, it's the wrong thing to do. I mean, to be fair though, failure, you've got to learn from failure. And, yes, particularly when we come to institutions, invest in businesses, they've got to make sure that they invest the right way, so there is no failure. But in terms of people, we have this term now in sort of in the world of enterprise, it's called to fail fast. And if you can do that, then, you know, you're not going to leave debtors. You're not going to drag the business on. It's like the worst type of failure is when people don't admit they've done wrong, and then they just drag this out and make it worse and worse and worse. And sometimes, you know, you've just got to say, it didn't work, stop the business, start again. But it's that starting again that's the most important thing. And I'll just give you a quick stat on that. Through our UK startup awards, we survey about between 1,200 to 1,500 new businesses a year, and we do a report on it. And what's fascinating is that 40% of those founders that are starting a business have previously failed, or have previously had a business that has not succeeded. So, you know, it is an integral part of the process. And, you know, in the US, they say if you haven't failed 3 times, you're not an entrepreneur. So it's maybe a societal difference or a cultural difference that perhaps in Wales we need to get over.
And do you think that a lot of those, or have you got any numbers on statistics on when those failures happen, are they down to a lack of experience in starting and running businesses of the individual, or is it that maybe the person and the idea is too early to market, it's too early into the world, or is it
well, it could be that, but the simple reason is cash.
Yeah,
the vast majority of businesses close down because they've run out of cash. You know, it's always easy to forget that you know, you do need that money in the business. And it's one of the things we've been looking at through part of the work we're doing. We're setting up and I can talk about it, we're setting up this new business centre in North Wales. What we want to do with the young people who go in there is for them to understand that, you know, you need to get your first customer as quickly as possible. It doesn't matter who they are. It doesn't matter if your product or service is not ready. Get that first customer, because there is a tendency, I believe, because of the way investment works and venture works, because you know, you can get somebody to give you £250,000, then you spend all that time trying to perfect your product or your service, and it'll never be perfect. So the best thing out is to go out there, test it with customers, and then obviously get that feedback and improve and improve and improve. So get that money in through the door and keep an eye on that money. And, you know, some of the best entrepreneurs that I know are those that are not only brilliant at marketing, or they understand their product or service exceptionally well. It's actually those that understand that at the end of the day, you've got to have money in the bank, because if you don't have it, you can't basically pay your suppliers. And more importantly, you can't pay your staff. And that is the death of any business. So
when you were made Wales's first professor of entrepreneurship, what came with that title, and what did you see is needed to be?
As it's nearly 30 years now to this May when I was told you got the job. I was 29 at the time, and it was an odd experience because I had no intention of becoming a professor. I was living in Ireland at the time, and I wanted to come back to Wales. I thought things were going to change. You know, it's like the rallying cry. Let's come back to Wales.
How do you mean? Sorry to interrupt you. How do you mean you thought it was going to change? In what way?
Well, you know, there was talk of devolution coming in, and you know, there was the potential for doing things differently, and also there was nothing going on in Wales at the time. None of the universities had any serious interest in entrepreneurship. I was lucky to have done my first job at Durham University Business School, which was the leading centre in Europe for small business and entrepreneurship at the time. I then spent 2 years in Ireland working with the Irish government as a Marie Curie postdoc fellow on the competitive advantage of small nations. And actually, I was doing that. I was thinking, hold on, if I'm going to look at the competitive advantage of small nations, why am I doing it in Ireland? There's one literally across the water where I come from, which is why I want to go back. And then this job came up as a professor, and I thought, this is ridiculous. I'm 29. There's no bloody chance I'm going to get it. And the reason I went across, which I thought, if I give a good interview, I'll write to them then and ask them for a lectureship. I was walking out, and I realized I'd left my bag in. So I went back, and they were still basically, they just finished considering. And I said, "Oh, do you mind? I'll just pick up my bag." And they said, "Do you mind holding on for a second?" And they said, "Yeah, well, look, we've decided to offer you the job." And I sort of looked around and said, it's the guy behind me has come in. And they said, and I said, and I remember, I always remember the line from the Deputy Vice Chancellor of the University of Glamorgan at the time, who was a bit of a character, Les Hobson. And he said, "I hope we don't come to regret the decision," he said. So I hope they didn't, but you know, it was an absolute shock to me. But it gave me, you know, that impetus to actually say, I'm going to prove myself in this job. I'm going to make sure that I'm going to create something really special at the University of Glamorgan and make us, you know, at the time, the leading institution in this. And I think that probably the best legacy of that was that by the time I left to go to Bangor University to take a second chair there, was that every university in Wales either had a chair in entrepreneurship or actually had somebody doing it, because we basically took it forward as a university at the time.
And do you think, and I'm thinking here as part, individually as a part of the Welsh diaspora, and from my conversations with a lot of the Welsh diaspora all over, particularly Middle East and the Americas, you know, something that comes up a lot, which is what you mentioned there, is the Irish, and to a slightly less extent Scotland, do this whole entrepreneurship and promoting themselves so much better than Wales. Why?
Well, there is a caveat to that. Yes, you could argue they're doing it very well now, but one of the things we worked on when I was at Glamorgan was we did a project where we looked at essentially business support in Wales, and it was a mess. And those were in the days where you had, let me think, 38 district councils and 8 county councils, and they all had economic development that they were offering different services. So we mapped that out for the first time, because there wasn't much stuff being done at a national level. So everybody talks about the Welsh Development Agency. They were doing absolutely sweet bugger all for entrepreneurs, not interested at all when I arrived in '96. And so we did the study, and then what we said is that you need basically a national enterprise strategy. This was picked up upon, and then it became a model called the Entrepreneurship Action Plan for Wales. And it was the first of its kind anywhere in the world. It was the first regional entrepreneurship strategy. Finland had tried to do something called a Decade of Entrepreneurship, which ran out after 6 years. Scotland had a business birth rate strategy, but only for new businesses. But this, you know, was looking at culture. How do you develop an entrepreneurial culture? How do you start businesses, and how you grow businesses? So it had something that nobody'd ever seen before. And it was, you know, we helped to shape it, we helped to develop it. And more importantly, it brought all the actors together, the private sector, the public sector, the voluntary sector, universities. It brought the voluntary sector together. It literally had everybody who would influence this. And it was literally from schools to large companies, everybody was involved. And it was fabulous. And we were involved in different ways. And but what was fascinating about it was that, and I think they spent a lot of the first tranche of Objective 1 money, European structural funds at the time, probably about 60 million over the period of the plan. But I think at the time, Wales was about, I've got to remember my data on this, but Wales was basically, in 2 years, it grew the number of new businesses by nearly a quarter, 25%, 25 to 27%. So it did what it said it would do. And it did it by targeting, you know, what we call underrepresented groups, women, ethnic minorities, young people, old people. So, you know, the male, pale and stale in the middle, don't worry about them, they've got to start businesses. but how do we grow by focusing on those, which every other country in the world has followed since. So, but the tragedy was when they disbanded the Welsh Development Agency in 2005, the Entrepreneurship Action Plan came under this. So, and I remember very, very clearly, because I was on the what do you call it, the executive board of the executive group running the whole thing. And the decision came, and I tried to fight hard to say, no, we can't lose this, because how can we spin it out? How can we do anything? And to be honest with you, it was lost in that political melee that went on when they abolished the WDA, the Wales Tourist Board, Elwa, and all these quangos. This literally massive bonfire of the quangos that went on under Rodney Morgan at the time. And it was a great shame, because I'll tell you, the evidence, the proof is always in the pudding, or in the statistics in this case. And the number of new businesses fell by exactly the same, by 25%. It was as if when all this tap was switched off, the whole balloon sort of deflated. And it hasn't really recovered since, to be perfectly honest with you. And Wales has continuously behind the curve when it comes to the creation of new businesses, which obviously has an impact on the economy.
So perhaps my next question is redundant then, but I was going to ask, has Wales moved on from there to develop culture?
My good friend, and who's now passed, Professor Martin Richard, and I wrote a review of this for a journal, and we tracked all this from 2000 to 2018. And I think what it is that it's what you alluded to at the beginning, is this lack of understanding of entrepreneurship. Everybody's heard of it now, you know, Dragon's Den, The Apprentice, probably the worst advert for entrepreneurship you can ever find anywhere. Now you have it, what is it, Shark Tank in Canada, probably, is it the equivalent or whatever? But, you know, everybody knows or has an idea of what an entrepreneur is, except by looks of our politicians. And I'm still trying to get this across. One of the things I aim to do, just after we have, you know, a new Senate with, you know, a lot of new members, you know, the vast majority will be new, is to do an information sheet or paper to show, look, this is what entrepreneurs do for Wales, but more importantly, what they could do for Wales if we're given better support, because, you know, that's what they don't understand. So, you know, if you walk down a high street, a politician will moan, oh, these supermarkets have taken over. Well, who do you think owns these independent shops? You know, who do you think spends 70 hours in them every week, you know, on probably less than the minimum wage? You know, these are the people who need your support. If you think about all the innovations that have happened, the vast majority of them are essentially entrepreneurial individuals who created businesses that have done this, you know, anything. And if you look at, you know, where the jobs have been created, all the data shows all net new jobs in any economy are created by new businesses, because large businesses, by their very nature, don't create jobs. Yeah. Because, you know, they need to become more efficient, more effective. Why? For shareholder value. And what's the best way to do that? Don't employ people. So they will tend to shrink over time, whereas obviously new businesses, as they create, I start a business, it's me and possibly the missus, and then, oh my God, I'm growing, I need to employ another person, and then, or maybe I need to be 2 people or 3 people, and this is the way jobs are created in an economy. But for some reason, our political classes seem to be completely unaware of that's how you create wealth and prosperity. And also, remember, when I talk about entrepreneurs, I'm not talking about just, shall we say, your average garden entrepreneur. I'm talking about the social entrepreneurs that are now increasingly picking up the slack where the public sector has failed. So without these individuals who are stepping up and really addressing, you know, some of the deep social issues that our local authorities and the Welsh government and other public bodies are dropping, then society in itself would be in a far worse place than it is without these people, you know, doing this as their careers, basically.
And has that that trend of the drop off that you talked about there, has that also been influenced by the no being, then obviously there's no money from European Union now coming into Wales? Is that affecting it?
I think yes and no. I think there was a lot of additionality, and government will always say we created X number of new jobs, right? Because of that money. To me, it's always more important, it's not necessarily the number of new jobs, the quality of new jobs, where those jobs are based, and more importantly, whether those jobs were sustainable or not. I think it would, but remember, the whole point about that money, structural money, that we were supposed to become wealthier. So, imagine if you were to put your money into a bank account and they say, we promise you that we will actually grow that money over time. And yet at the end of 20 years, you come back and say, well, actually, you're actually poorer than you were when we started. And that's essentially where Wales ended up to an extent, in that we were, at a certain level, and that level actually I believe it didn't crash, but it didn't get any richer. And that was the whole point. If you invest your money in the right place, you expect your economy to grow. And I think it became more of a vehicle for vanity projects by both politicians and, I hate to say it, universities, rather than thinking, okay, how do we get the most bang for our buck from doing that investment? How do we invest in young people in particular? So as an example, so those young people will gain qualifications, will start new businesses, and can stand on their own 2 feet to actually add to the prosperity of Wales.
So if I'm drawing the right conclusions from what you're saying, is that a politician or political group in government in Wales needs to have a roadmap, a strategy for how it encourages entrepreneurs that are going to add meaningful long-term value. And when you've got that in place, it's a lot easier to target your financing into that organization and those strategies. And that will obviously feed itself, because those businesses will become successful and you can generate more tax and jobs and so forth.
I'll give you a lovely example of what the next government could do, but will probably won't. We all know the impact of AI, right? And there's debates about whether, the impact of AI will have the metal equivalent of Arnold Schwarzenegger walking down our road in 5 years' time, right? Or what jobs it will replace, or what jobs it will create. But in business, the whole point about AI is that it makes things quicker, it makes things simpler, it makes things more efficient and more effective. Certainly in our business, we've embraced it. And what it's done, when there are 10 steps to doing something, we end up in a situation where using AI, we can actually turn that into 1 step. Now imagine if those 10 steps involve X number of people, it involves different processes. That has essentially cut parts of our processes by literally 90 to 95% without actually cutting a job. We just repurpose our people to be more creative and more, so they're not doing the mundane stuff that is important to our business, but we can get somebody else to do it. Now, productivity is the death of any economy. So what I'd love to see, and I was talking to a very prominent entrepreneur, Simon Gibson, who works with Sir Terry Matthews in Wesley Clover this morning, and he's doing stuff that I can only dream about in terms of AI. And one of the things that he proposed was, imagine if we could put these tools into every business in Wales. Simple tools that would make that business more efficient and more effective, not to lose a job, but just to release the time. I remember a study a few years ago that showed that your average, micro business that's under 10 employees the owner was spending at least 2 days a week dealing with paperwork. And I can imagine it's probably more. That's all they'd admit to.
Yeah.
Imagine get rid of that. And those 2 days, if they could release even one of those days, that they could be out with customers, they could be focusing on innovation, they could be making that business better. And I think if we could basically turn around as a nation and say, sod it, this is where we're going to put all our money into. Currently, we spend £20 million a year on business support. I'd get rid of it all, and this is where I would focus, because in the end, you know, if businesses can embrace this and become better, more efficient, more effective, it changes everything. You can imagine, say, you know, in terms of tourism, imagine if that became more effective in terms of the tourism industry and how we could make, for example, I absolutely guarantee you, right, that if we took 100 businesses now, not one of those businesses, I'd say maybe one, maybe two, right? But the vast majority of those businesses wouldn't have used, you know, something like Claude, the latest version of Claude 4.5, to actually analyze their websites to see if it was efficiently bringing people in. So you don't need an SEO expert for this anymore. It'll look at it and say, have you got the right words? Are you doing it the right way? We've done it, and it's the proof of the pudding. We were thinking we had the best website ever. It basically told us it was crap. It looked nice, but it was crap, right? It wasn't. And we thought, oh, that's the reason people aren't coming in. Oh, we were hitting people, seriously. And, you know, we'd get, for our business, you know, we'd have 10, 20 businesses register every day. We're now up to over 100 already by changing simple things, you know, where do you put this? Where do you put that? And it would take, and you don't need to be, you know, a software expert on this. You just need to know basically how to do it yourself. So yeah, that's a simple example. But imagine if you can make businesses 5% more efficient. That, if you think about the, or shall we say 5% more efficient, if you think about the impact of that, the GDP of Wales is about, what, 70, 80 billion? So we're talking about a 4 billion increase. Where the hell else are you going to get that across the Welsh economy? You know, we talk about bringing all this money in through investment summits. And the simplest thing to do is to just make our businesses more productive and embrace this rather than reject it.
I wholeheartedly agree with you. And I wonder, though, whether that is down to political culture, because we still have, not just Wales, but across a lot of Western society, political cultures of fearing the innovation and protecting your own little sphere, and rather than the way that we work as entrepreneurs, one works as entrepreneurs, if I'm to, you know, allow myself to be one, then we know that we can't do anything without interacting with other individuals, and we know that we need help and we need input, and part of that is embracing new technologies like AI and using them in a thoughtful, constructive way. But it's also understanding when you don't know something and you need to go to someone.
Absolutely.
And I would argue that political culture is very protectionist of the self, and not admitting when you don't know anything, and not admitting that, oh, I need to go off and ask the broader world of, how do I do this job better? So how if that summary that I put to you is something you agree with, how do we change that? How do we change that mindset so there's a more entrepreneurial mindset within the class?
You can't only blame the civil service. You've got to blame you can't blame politicians. You've got to blame the civil service as well. As somebody said, nobody rose to be permanent secretary by taking a risk. So you know, it's the status quo all the time. So, you know, trying to change the status quo is, and I'll give you an example of this in my dealings with government. So Edwina Hart was, whatever you thought of her politics, she was a force of nature. And Edwina always tried to bring people in which she considered could help her and help with the mission of making Wales a more successful economy. She has her critics, she has her backers. I worked with Edwina for over 2 years, and she called me in. She said, Dylan, you know, there's a problem with accessing finance in Wales. I know you've written on it extensively. Rather than just writing on it, you want to do something about it. It's a very tempting way. She was very persuasive. And so I said, fine. So she said, right, we need to do a review. Nobody else has done a review. It was a first ever review. Now, remember, this was in 2013. So we're talking still in the sort of backwash of the tsunami of the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. So the banks were still not lending. They were still, still hadn't built up their capital base to be able to do that. Small firms were not getting access to finance. So much to a credit, she wanted a unique Welsh solution. So I spent 2 years of my life doing this, but the first year I spent essentially doing the research. As an academic, you've got to find out everything. We found out some things about the Welsh economy that nobody had ever known before. For example, we found out there was a gap in funding of about £500 million between what businesses wanted and what was being supplied. We used databases that were hidden away about, how banks were lending, how much they were lending, for example. We found this obscure database that would tell you the number of loans by region, by sector. You could never access it. I don't know where I found it, but it was one of the banks that put it up on some, I wouldn't say the dark web, but it was hidden. Let's put it that way. And we actually wrote a paper based on that was published in a 4-star journal. It was the only academic bit I got out of it. But it basically showed that the Wales the banks were lending smaller amounts of money, and they were lending less frequently. And it was micro and small businesses, micro and new businesses that were actually getting far less than any other part of the UK. So the vehicle at the time for this was Finance Wales. I'd been a director of Finance Wales for 6 years when it started. And it was a collection of basically funds brought together. So it was basically a sort of fund manager rather than anything else. And then by the time I was doing this, it had got more European money and it was putting more money out. But the biggest criticism about it, that its interest rates were too high, its terms were too onerous, its culture was opaque, blah, blah, blah. So I looked at the development bank and the interest rates were ridiculous. I remember at that time, interest rates had plunged to what, 0.5%, right? And it was this beautiful curve. So when interest rates were about 8%, the actual, shall we say, the top up from the development bank was something like 3 or 4%. So people moaning, they're charging 12%. Well, yes, but interest rates were 8. So actually it's only 4% per base, so it's fine. But then when it crashed, when they reduced interest rates to boost the economy after the financial crisis, now, let's do the sums here. If it was at 8% and it was at 12%, then if it went down to 0.5%, you would expect the interest rates to be 4.5%. Yeah. They kept them at 12. So it was a way of you're thinking, hold on, you're a public bank, you're owned a public organisation, you're owned by the Welsh government, and you're basically taking advantage of businesses in Wales at a time when they can't get access to affordable finance, which is key. And this is what I've always found a bit odd, because surely the role of a publicly owned fund or bank or whatever you want to call it is to help small businesses in the best way possible. But no, there was always excuses. Oh, de minimis, blah, 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 right? All these rules, which we proved wasn't the case at all. So I came up with this infamous line, which the BBC decided to splash all over its news, that it wasn't fit for purpose. And it was the term I used. The civil servants went apoplectic with me, because remember, I was a special advisor. I was advising on this, right? But what they wanted was basically things to be the same. You can't rock the apple cart. And I thought, sometimes, to paraphrase, you've got to throw a hand grenade into a portaloo, right? See what happens. It could be Jackson Pollock, or it could just be a bunch of shit on the wall. You don't know, right? But sometimes you've got to do it, and you've got to have the courage to do it. And I can tell you, the establishment in Wales, particularly the financial and corporate support establishments, did everything they could to stop this happening. But thank God for Edwina. She said, right, let's go ahead and do it. And what happened was I proposed a new development bank for Wales. So we brought the whole of the, I brought an amazing panel, because, I'd done the research, but now I needed experts in their field, from venture capital, to angel funding, to government finance, to invoice financing, to investment banking. These people were at the top of their game, and my role was to chair it, which was an honor for me to work with such amazing people. And we came up with the plan for the development bank, and the plan was essentially get rid of Finance Wales, create a new organization that would utilize its funding to close the gap, because we found essentially there were gaps. Banks were ready to lend, but they weren't ready to lend everything. So I'll give you an example. So if you've got a property worth £1 million and you're thinking, right, I want to borrow £1 million, I can put this property up and I'll get £1 million because I've got collateral. Oh, no. There's this thing called loan to value. So we probably let you have 70%, because we've got to be careful. Now, if it's in a fire sale situation, they'll ask for 60, but that means you can borrow 700 grand, but you need £1 million. So the bank will lend you that. So really what we were talking about is that, why don't we have, the development bank come in on the back of that and provide the gap funding? Because that's the gap that's needed. So all of a sudden you get your £1 million, the bank's happy, the entrepreneur's happy, and you've provided that. Unfortunately, it didn't turn out that way. We lobbied hard, but there were, particularly in the government and particularly in the Labour Party at the time, who for some reason felt that the Finance Wales was Rodney Morgan's legacy, only because it was created before Rodney came in, but Rodney was a champion of it, and it was, to use the term, he was urinating on his legacy. It was never the case. It was an evolution, as should happen. But what essentially happened, that Finance Wales became the development bank, and with the culture, the same issues, everything. And we can come maybe to talk about what's happened since, but when it was set up in 2017, interestingly enough, the chief executive was appointed for Finance Wales. He then became the chief executive of the development bank and is still there. Most of his senior team actually came across from Finance Wales. So, nothing changed. And remember, whatever you say about strategy, the old adage, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And if your organizational culture is wrong, if your approach is, we operate as a bank and we need to look at everything as if we were anywhere, rather than saying, as I said to them, your number one issue, right? And the question you should be asking yourself is, what am I going to do for Welsh business today? How am I going to make Welsh businesses more competitive? Because we were the first development bank in the UK, and we had the opportunity to give Welsh businesses a real competitive advantage in terms of finance, and we failed to do it. And we just became another provider. And, my view, I feel I failed to push the case hard enough, and I'll regret that I didn't. And, I see some of the messes that have happened since within the bank, as a story you'll see over the next few weeks will happen. But it's become, it's become really sad, really, that something we had a real advantage in, well ahead of the rest of the UK, and we didn't take it beyond where it was at the time. And it's an interesting story. Maybe one I'll put into my in my autobiography one day if I ever get the time to write.
I was going to say, that sounds like
the real.
Well, yeah. But maybe you touched on things being evolution and the migration of processes. So going from the development bank, what's your view on a sovereign wealth fund for Wales? Would that help with some of these issues?
Well, I was going to say, whose sofa are you going to get that money from?
Yeah. I mean, obviously there's bigger constitutional political aspects that would need to be tackled as well.
I mean, yes, it would. But I think the problem we've got at the moment is that, and maybe you're right, maybe we need a revolution, because we've tried evolution for evolution, devolution, revolution. That's a book. That's a title for an academic book, isn't it? I'm nicking that now. Do not copyright. But when you think about it, is that we've tried to evolve, And I think we've adopted Ron Davis's process around an event a bit too literally, and I think that evolution hasn't done Wales well, because if you look at everywhere we are, when you had the new nation, I remember the feeling in '97. I was invited down to the Old Park Hotel for the event, because I sort of helped out a little bit here and there. And I was absolutely adamant this was going to be a new Wales, a new way of thinking, as I suppose all revolutions, set in. It's like the French Revolution. They all ended up infighting and chopping each other's heads off by the end of it, didn't they? So, but it's the same here. I suppose there was that sense of hope and that sense of expectation as well. And I think our political classes have let us down enormously with that. I think everybody else was ready for it and ready to embrace it. I think certainly our entrepreneurial classes were. Everybody's ready to say, what are we going to do in Wales? I think our cultural classes were. I think our, every part of society embraced that, except our politicians, who I believe, I mustn't be too cruel, because I know what a hard job it is to be a politician. But sometimes I think they saw it more as of a job rather than a vocation. And, unless you really see yourself as somebody who is going to change the world, what's the point of going into that? Because it's the one opportunity you're going to get. And unfortunately, many of them haven't even changed Wales, never mind the rest of the globe.
And I suppose that feeds into that entrepreneurial ambition, doesn't it? It's how do you create a nation of people that are not only aspiring to be business leaders, but they may want to become innovative in politics or go from being a business leader into politics.
Yeah.
It's something that a lot of other small nations seem to have done very well. I guess Estonia is a place that a lot of people use as an example. But have you any thoughts on what's the psyche there?
Well, let me ask you a question, right, which is interesting. In its 26 years of devolution, have we had a rallying cry for Wales? Have we had to said, Wales will be the best, right? And it's one of the points I make in an article I've written for St. David's Day for the Western Mail, is that, a small nation can't be good at everything, but it should be good at something. And, I'll say that again. A small nation can't be good at everything, but it should be good at something. And we're not, and we really could be, if we focus on something. And I think we just haven't, when we see a problem, we run away from it. It's as if we accept mediocrity as the standard. And it's easy to do so. And sometimes, when I wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning thinking, right, what I'm going to write today, and I'm thinking, oh, maybe I can't be asked anymore. Who cares? Nobody cares. I mean, I've been spouting this for 20 bloody odd years. Nobody's listening, but you've got to keep at it. That is the perseverance is the most important trait of any entrepreneur. Never give up. Never. I'm sounding like Rocky Balboa now. I'll tell you. But every time they hit you, gotta come up back. It's not. It's this ability, I think, that we've got to set our sights higher, and give those people with that vision the support they need. I mean, it's easy, How do you wilt a beautiful flower? You don't feed it water. And this is what happens time and time again, that we have these amazing businesses that start up and they're not given the support that they're required, not given the support they're needed. And, support goes to businesses that clearly should never have been given a penny of funding. Why? Because, hate to say it, they know somebody who knows somebody, or they believe the bullshit, and be professional about it. One of the things we found was that one of the biggest challenges we have in Wales is getting the money in to help businesses grow. Like I said, the most important thing, not only for businesses to survive, but more importantly, to grow. And what we find is that basically in Wales, you know, we have minute amounts of money going to businesses. I mean, yes, we have the problem that most venture capital, 83% of all early stage venture capital in the UK goes to London, the southeast, and the east of England. Now, let's reverse that. That means 7/10 of the economy, or 7/10 of the UK, right? Sorry, it's 7/12 of the UK. I forgot, right? Doesn't basically get, what do you call it? Sorry, I'm getting my figures wrong. Get this right. Basically means that 70% of the UK gets 17% of the funding. That's unacceptable in so many ways. And obviously Wales is affected by that. So what happens is that if 83% of the funding, so you've got to say, well, hold on, what's going wrong here? And you can see there's more innovative businesses, and the more innovative businesses are, the more they attract venture capital, blah, blah, blah. We're not doing our job here in Wales. And we've had 26 years to do this. So, you know, maybe the time has come now. Everybody's thinking there's going to be a change in May, of one sort or another. I sincerely hope so, because, you know, like I said, it's easy to come in with great ideas, but it's whether you actually follow those ideas through and persevere with them. And that's what really worries me, in that I don't see a vision for Wales. You know, we can say Wales needs to be healthier, Wales needs to be, you know, more, you know, wealthier and all this stuff, but it's not really a vision. Every country has that. What we need to do is to say, this is where we want to be, and to go for it.
Yeah, it's deciding what you want to be. And, you know, I'm former professional cyclist, so if I'd be like, Wales should be leading the world in professional cycling and should be putting them.
Why not? Well, why not?
We're going to put all our sports funding into that, or whatever it might be. And same with business. Like, okay, there's, you know, quite a healthy ecosystem of companies that work in space tech.
Let me give you a lovely example of this, which I've been banging on for 20 odd years. So with devolution, we do money for so basically higher education is devolved, even though we don't get, obviously, students finance devolved directly, and economic development is devolved, but innovation and research funding isn't. So as a result, basically Wales, and what happens is it's a spiral of decline. So, you know, if you don't get investment to begin with, you're not going to invest in your universities and innovative businesses, which means they will get smaller, and they won't be able to attract the staff that need it to create the science that attracts more investment, and then attracts more staff, attracts more science, blah, blah, blah. So we get about between 2.5% and 3%, right? Now, you're saying, well, okay, we should get 5% according to, you know, various consequentials. But what that means is basically the gap, and it's difficult to estimate it properly, is anywhere between 200 million to 400 million per year. Now, that's a lot of money that is not going into our universities for research, and our universities are in, shall we say, slight financial difficulties, or to innovative businesses that could turn that funding into, you know, world-beating products, world-beating technologies. So we're not getting access to that. And as yet, nobody has stood up. I think the First Minister, because obviously the pressure she's been under, said, oh, I'm going to ask Keir Starmer for this now. But with all respect to Lynette, 26 years later, we should have had that then. Can you imagine if Wales had had that money, right? Yes, we had the money from Europe, but we didn't have the money because of the way Europe worked to put directly into our research and innovative base. It would have been transformational, because for every pound you put in there, you know, the return is 10 to 20 to 30 times down the road. So it's a typical of an issue that we have, where Wales loses out, right? Not because of respect agenda, it's because the way, essentially, the system's been put together, and no politician has actually challenged the system to say, guess what, guys, we need to have that 5%. There's been a lot of talk about rail, and I love rail, right? and rail funding and, you know, the HS2 consequential, blah, blah, blah. That's fine, right? But you imagine if we had, over the term of a Welsh government, that could be as much as £2 billion of money that would be earmarked to research, development and innovation, and it would be transformational.
I think that all goes to what you and I have both been saying in this conversation. No matter what colour of political party you're from, it's about having that ambition for Wales as a nation rather than you as in your political career, and putting Wales and its future ahead of yourself and where you're going. So,
but and this is quite important, right? And I think it's as if, I don't know if it's the shadow of the neighbour across the road, right? Sorry, across the border, and it does cast a big shadow, particularly in, you know, our more prosperous areas because of the cross border. But I do find it galling that our institutions constantly put Welsh businesses at a disadvantage when we have the devolution dividend to put them at an advantage. So I use the case of the development bank. You know, the first thing they should have done is, rather than saying we can't do this, they should have said, well, what can we get away with to maximize the competitive advantage of Welsh businesses? It's simple. You know, I made the case, but they should have done that. They said, no, we can't do it. And the problem is that, you know, to an extent, is that they look to England for guidance on how to do things. Or they basically stick to the rules to an extreme extent that nothing happens. Interestingly, I don't know if you know this, with the furore over the funding of the Welsh Rugby Union during COVID, the DCMS were responsible for supporting English rugby clubs, and of course the Welsh government, because it's been devolved, was responsible for the 4 regional sides. The DCMS charged 2% interest to English clubs and said that's what we're going to charge because this was the rate. The Welsh government charged 8% interest. Do you know why? Because under their advice that they'd been given, they had to charge that because that was the what they perceived to be the real interest rate. So all of a sudden, can you see that? It's instant, isn't it? Instant disadvantage. So that was estimated about £200,000-300,000 a year per rugby club. So they were paying that extra interest. I mean, it's sheer madness, and it's always as if, you know, we've got to stick to the rules or do this. Whatever. The first thing is that how can we make this as advantageous to Wales, to Welsh business, to Welsh organisations, to Welsh culture, to Welsh society? Forget everything else. Forget the political, you know, glasses that you see this through. The most important thing is, how can we utilise all the institutions that we have in Wales to make sure that Wales is a better place, and make that, you know, the clarion call, rather than, as we always do, stick to the rules, you know, and place our businesses and our organisations at a disadvantage compared to those across the border.
And of course, since that time, we've also got the Internal Markets Act, which puts Wales at a disadvantage now as well. So that's something. But I'm conscious of your time, and I'd like to maybe ask a broader question of looking ahead of where you envision Wales is going to be in 15 years from now, entrepreneurial wise, or in a broader context, whichever you feel.
Shall I have a hope rather than a despair answer to this, as they say?
That'd be great if we could finish the podcast on, I think, uplift and
yeah, it always brings me to mind a question like this. There used to be a pub on the North Road when I was a student in Cardiff. Used to walk down the North Road from Talabon to town for a night out, and it was this big pink house called the Hope. As one of my friends quit one, you know, that's not the hope, it's more like the bloody despair. And if you drank in there, you'd actually realise why. But yeah, you know, hopefully, I mean, one of the things we haven't done, and I think it's because we failed to do it, was I think it's important, you know, number one, to have a clear economic strategy for Wales, and to be good at what we're really good at. We can't be good at everything, and I think we're always trying to be good at everything. And ironically, I think there's two areas that in terms of industries we're actually really good at, which is compound semiconductors, but we haven't taken full advantage of the £500 million that's gone into that at the moment. You know, there's been no real spin out from that, even though that's where the biggest spin outs in the UK are coming from. And the other one is obviously insurtech. You know, if you think about it, go compare Admiral, many supermarkets in the north, you know, and Cardiff has become and is becoming a strong financial and a fintech centre. So those are those two areas. But also I think that what we're finding is that there is an enormous talent base within our universities, which is underutilized. I don't know if you heard about this amazing company that has now had venture capital investment. It's a venture capital of $140 million called Drag Therapeutics. It's an investment company set up by Kate Bingham, who developed what's making us actually be able to talk here today, the vaccine. You know, when people say that Wales doesn't have the capability and the capacity and the innovation and the entrepreneurship to do this, you know, to be able to have a company that's been able to do that, you know, that shouldn't be an outlier. My worry is that at the moment it is. So in 15 years' time, what we should be doing is producing 3 or 4 drug therapeutics a year, right? Not once in a blue moon. And that to me would be something. I'd also, you know, one of the biggest issues that we have, and we were having a debate about this morning, a couple of people, is that we don't have enough businesses in Wales. That sounds odd, doesn't it? Right? But if you look at the number of businesses we have in Wales, it's per head of population, it's considerably below the UK average. But when you actually look at the prosperous areas, we say, well, that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter about the number of businesses, the quality of businesses, right? Well, yeah, okay, fine. I think, you know, you still got to have volume. But if you look at London, southeast of England and east of England, which I mentioned are the so-called Golden Triangle, the most prosperous 3 regions in the UK, those are the 3 with the highest number of businesses per head of population in the UK. Because what it does, it creates markets. It basically creates wealth, it creates jobs. So the more businesses you can create, you know, the more business you have in economy, the richer that economy. So to me, if I was going to say, where do I start with now, I'd set a target to hitting the UK average in terms of that within 15 years. That would transform the Welsh economy. It would absolutely transform the Welsh economy. And again, you know, if we're going to make our business a better business, go back to that AI stuff I talked about. Just embrace new technologies. Don't be scared of them. But also, I think we've got to be braver as a nation and not be afraid of success and being successful. I remember having this debate about some political parties, one of which has now decided not to do it, but about having higher, you know, rates of tax for the higher taxpayers. And they were talking about emulating Scotland. They're doing 48%. And the amount of money that would bring in would be negligible, right? Because most of them would bugger off, right? Or use, shall we say, creative accounting methods to minimize their tax bill. Instead, would it be a better aim to say we want to double the number of higher rate taxpayers in Wales? Because if we have that and we had control over our tax, wouldn't that be better? That could bring in something like, you know, anywhere between 250 to 500 million of extra tax into Wales, which is fantastic. But you're only going to do that if you have, you know, more ambitious entrepreneurs creating more ambitious businesses that employ people at a higher salary, right? Who then go out and spend that money in Wales, in their communities. So it's not a difficult thing. And, you know, if we can embrace that mentality that it's not wrong to want to be a prosperous nation, but we can't be a prosperous nation just waiting for England to actually give us more money all the time. We've got to create the wealth ourselves, because if we create that wealth ourselves, we can recirculate it. It stays in Wales, it's spent in Wales, and more importantly, it benefits Wales.
Wholeheartedly agree with you. So final sort of question then. Obviously, you do your regular article, which you spend early mornings worrying about what to construct and write about. What else are you up to at the moment, is that the listener might be interested in?
Oh, well, it's great. You know, I mean, I've been involved in businesses for 20 odd years, more longer than that. I was part of a business in North Wales. I spun out two of my students. Bangor University decided to start a business, asked me to be the chairman and investor. Little did I know, we got to a point where, this is a true story, by the way, when I had to put my house on the line because of one of the founders had spectacularly cocked up the finances, and the bank was about to foreclose, and we had 40 employees at the time. It was a very difficult conversation with my then wife. I didn't, you know, I had put the house up for a certain amount because the boys had maxed out, and we got through it. But, you know, it's an interesting lesson. And like I said, you know, cash is king. I learned that personally. And of course, you know, I had a share in the business, and I've been involved in different businesses. So now I'm doing it literally full time. I still write. I got a journal article published this week in a 4-star journal, which is the ultimate thing for an academic. And I managed, I managed to do that by not being a full-time academic. So it's actually quite cool. But now, you know, that's not my priority anymore. So I'm running a business with my partner, Francesca, and Fran and I have, you know, what we want to do is to create an entrepreneurial community through what we do. And it's interesting, the journey. We started off as an events business. We sort of metamorphosed into an events and data business because of all the data we were gathering on businesses. And now we've sort of metamorphosed again into a community. And the apex of that is what we call Ideas Fest, which is, it's basically somebody twigged at the Glastonbury for Business, which I'm not too sure if the Eva's family have heard it yet, and we're going to get a letter through the post on this. But what it is basically, it's basically you know, entrepreneurs in a field. So rather than having acts, we have talks, and we have tents with people talking. And this will be our 4th one this year. We're holding it at Champneys in Hertfordshire, which is a nice place. They've got 200 acres, and we're taking it to another level, which is always bloody scary, because, you know, the scary thing always is trying to get those tickets sold. But I think, you know, to me, that's one part of it. The other part is we're starting to see how the community is trying to help itself. And I think what I have found in the community, and goes back to your first question, I think, about when you ask the question about entrepreneurs are seen as being, you know, money-led and selfish. I can honestly tell you that from my experience over the last 30 years, but particularly in the last 3 years, that the kindness shown not only to us, but to other entrepreneurs by other entrepreneurs has been out, you know, it's astonishing. You know, you can literally pick up a phone and say, look, I'm having a problem. Can you talk me through it? And say, are you in London next week? Come over. We'll sit down, have a cup of coffee. These are people who are running multi-million-pound businesses. And I think that's what people forget, that, you know, like in every profession, you know, there are bastards, right? There's always bastards in every profession, you know. Some professions have more bastards than others, but in entrepreneurship, we find, you know, maybe it's the 90-10 principle in favor of the non-bastards, right? So, so in that case, I think that that's what I've discovered more than anything else. So it's how we maximize that community. And it's a project we're working on at the moment. Is, you know, we have 100,000 people we have within the community in a very loose way at the moment. How do we solidify that? And then my personal project, the 2 ones I have, this is why I do get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, is that I discovered I knew this, that we had this, that over the last 3 years, I'd gathered basically unique data on over 3,200 startups through our awards, which basically tells me what what their challenges are, what their inspirations are, how they're running their business, and I've got it all. No university has this data. So thanks, that would have taken me the rest of my life to analyze, but thanks to AI, AI can help me organize the data, and then I can start looking for patterns and help me look for patterns, and I can maybe finally write, my magnum opus on entrepreneurship from that. And then the big project, which I'm working on with our business partner and investor Nick Pritchard, is we've bought a building called Bodlondeb in Conwy, which is the old county council offices, and the aim is to turn it into an entrepreneurship centre to give essentially young people a home. It's a bloody big building. It's 50,000 square foot. It's got a car park for 100 cars. It's got 2 lodges. It's got land behind it that's big enough to build a 100-bedroom hotel, which is potentially something we could be doing. But the whole idea is, I believe, I'm a GOG, I'm a North Walian. I really want to have this. And this is the most important thing. This is a private sector project. Nick is investing. Nick was very successful in business. He's investing his own money in making this successful. And we're going to give 50 spaces for young people for free in the space. And, and they can access our networks, our mentoring, and even some seed funding from this. Because we can do, 50 every year. That's 250 businesses over 5 years. And that really has an impact, particularly if we push them out everywhere. And it becomes sort of that magnet, I hope, for doing stuff elsewhere. So that is, that is something that I really hope that we can do well. And I think the most important thing, it is a private sector driven project. And to be fair, I've had really great conversations with Welsh Government. And I suppose what I've said to them, look, unlike most other business support organizations, which I suppose we will become because we're trying to support businesses, we don't need you and we don't need to work with you, but we'd like to work with you. And I think that's a refreshing change because I think we've built up this sort of dependency culture in Wales to an extent, particularly in business support, where most of the money comes from the Welsh Government, and we're saying, well, actually, we'll do it as a private sector organisation and bring in the best. So maybe in 15 years' time, we will have bought up every old bloody building in Wales and our entrepreneurship centre in it. But let's make the first one a success first.
Well, best of luck with that. So Professor Dylan Jones-Evans, diolch yn fawr for being today's guest.
Thank you so much for your time. It's been very illuminating, particularly from my point of view, because I haven't thought about many of these points for quite a while, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to share them.
Appreciate you doing so. If you enjoyed this conversation, have comments on today's topic, or would like to donate to our work to keep New Wales going, then please do so. You can go over to our website, which is a really easy one to remember because it's new.wales. Diolch yn fawr.